The day broke in silence, the sky still painted with pale shades of pink and blue. A gentle breeze slipped through the open windows, carrying the fresh scent of lavender from the garden. The Montero mansion, quiet at that hour, seemed suspended in time, as if waiting for something grand to happen. Upstairs, Emily was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, wrapped in a light satin robe. She gazed at the horizon through the window, her eyes fixed on a distant point that even she couldn't quite define. In her chest, a tight knot, not of fear, but of anticipation. This was no ordinary morning. It was the beginning of a day that would end with the most important event in the city, the traditional gala ball of the National Philanthropic Society. A night long awaited, carefully planned, and talked about for months. But for Emily, it would be more than just a social event. It would be the night when everyone would finally discover who she truly was. Outside, the staff were already moving through the corridors with hurried steps. The house was slowly awakening, but Emily remained silent. She knew what lay ahead. She knew the suspicious glances and forced smiles she would receive that night weren't any different from those that had followed her ever since the day she said yes to the love of her life. James Montero was more than a successful businessman. He was the heir to an empire built on steel, energy, and power. A man admired, respected, and coveted. And she, in the eyes of many, was just a modest-looking woman without a prestigious last name who had somehow managed to win him over. Since joining that family, Emily had become the target of harsh glances and words polished with disdain. Margaret, the mother-in-law, always elegant and relentless, let her criticisms escape like perfume into the air, discreet but full of intent. Charlotte, James's sister, didn't hide her poison. From their first meeting, she had made it clear she preferred another woman by her brother's side, Victoria, a childhood friend, wealthy, well-known in high society, and always impeccable. The two mother-in-law and sister-in-law made sure to remind, even without direct words, that Emily did not belong in that world of exclusive dresses, family heirlooms, and surnames whispered at important dinners. But what no one knew, what all the sharp tongues ignored, was that Emily not only belonged to that world, she had chosen not to be part of it. Behind the simple name and reserved demeanor was a story carefully hidden. Emily came from one of the most traditional and wealthy families in the country. Her real last name, purposefully omitted in social settings, was known in circles where even Margaret had to choose her words wisely. But she had never needed that, never wanted to shine because of inherited titles or old fortunes. Her love for James began before any revelations, on an ordinary afternoon, without masks or ulterior motives. And for that love, she had chosen to remain silent, discreet, invisible to eyes that only saw what they could measure. However, everything has a limit. The veiled humiliations, the cruel comments, and the way they tried to push her out of James's life, all of it had been building like a silent tide, now threatening to overflow. Emily was not the type to respond with shouting. Her silence was more eloquent, her patience more strategic. And that night, amid the glow of chandeliers and toasts with French champagne, Emily would cease to be the overlooked woman. Not out of vanity, not out of revenge, but because sometimes silence must be broken and truth revealed. Emily grew up surrounded by silence and sophistication, not the empty silence of cold and lonely houses, but the comforting silence of a thoughtful upbringing, surrounded by rare books, old paintings, and parents who believed that greatness didn't come from what one flaunts, but from what one is, even when one has everything. An only child from a traditional lineage in the south of the country, she carried in her full name, hidden from the world, the strength of 3 generations of entrepreneurs, diplomats, and philanthropists who had helped shape part of the nation's economic and social history. The Whitmore Kingsley family never liked the spotlight. Wealthy, yes, but discreet to the point of never appearing in society columns or sponsoring scandals. Her father was a man of few words and firm gestures. Her mother, sweet and refined, kept her feet on the ground even with the high heels of charity galas. From a young age, Emily was taught to see the world beyond appearances. She attended the best schools, spoke 4 languages before she was 18, but never felt comfortable in the halls where everything seemed like a competition of sparkle and surnames. At 24, she decided to do something unthinkable for most women of her class. She asked to live under a common name. She gave up the Kingsley in social records and began using only her maternal grandmother's name, who had always told her, "Having a beautiful name means nothing if you don't have a story to tell." Emily wanted her own story. Away from the usual circles, she moved to a quiet coastal town, where she opened a small bookstore cafe. Her days there were simple: books, background music, coffee brewed by her own hands, and customers who came not out of convenience, but affection. It was there, behind the old wooden counter, that she met James Montero. He came in one day, looking for a gift for his mother. He wore a shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, sunglasses hanging from his collar, and a look that betrayed the weariness of someone who spent too much time surrounded by difficult decisions. Emily helped him choose a rare book of poems. They spoke briefly, like 2 strangers, not expecting to meet again. But he returned. Once, twice, 3 times. Sometimes with no reason. Sometimes just to hear her voice as she explained the titles on the shelf. James never spoke about money, business, or power, and Emily never asked questions. One day, sitting on the beach with their bare feet in the cold sand, he asked, "You never wanted to know who I am." "I already know who you are," she replied, smiling, "and that's what matters." At that moment, he knew, and it didn't take long for him to ask for her hand. The proposal was simple, almost shy. No giant diamond ring, no cinematic dinner. Just him, kneeling on the bookstore floor, among the books, with a look that said it all. "Will you spend the rest of your life with me, exactly the way we are now?" She said yes. It didn't take long for the truth about him to come to light. Emily learned that James was the heir to one of the country's largest companies, that his name circulated among investors and politicians, that his image was as sought after as his fortune. But love had already been established, and none of that mattered. What she hadn't expected was that the world around him would look at her as a mistake. From the first lunch at the Montero family mansion, Emily felt the weight of her mother-in-law's gaze, as if her presence there was a mistake, a detour. Charlotte, the sister-in-law, made disguised remarks about etiquette, fashion, and humble origins. Victoria, the perfect friend in everyone's eyes, appeared shortly after. Gorgeous, influential, always ready to offer well-intentioned advice to James. Emily never responded with attacks, not out of weakness, but by choice. She knew who she was, but even the strongest women bleed in silence. On lonely nights, Emily wondered if she had done the right thing by hiding her origins. If the pain of being seen as someone who didn't deserve to be there was worse than being chased by the fame of her own name. But she quickly remembered the reason. She didn't want to be chosen for her name. She wanted to be loved for her essence. And James loved her. Truly still, there was a breaking point. And the approaching gala ball would be that point. Because there is a difference between humility and submission. And Emily, even with her soft voice and serene gaze, was never a woman who accepted being diminished. At the Montero family mansion, tradition was more than a concept. It was an unwritten rule. From the portraits hanging on the entrance hall walls, to the cutlery inherited from past generations, everything in that house seemed to remind those who entered that time did not change certain structures. Margaret Montero, the matriarch, embodied that spirit perfectly. Her posture was always impeccable, her gaze sharp, her voice low but precise. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make clear what she wanted. She was used to being heard and obeyed. From the very beginning, Margaret observed Emily with a mix of suspicion and coldness. She received her with elegance, yes, but it was the same elegance she used with maids and waiters, polite, functional, and distant. At one of the first dinners, Emily still remembered the words carefully chosen by her mother-in-law. "You have a peculiar beauty, and that's a good thing. Different, but interesting." It wasn't a compliment. It was a veiled sentence. Charlotte, on the other hand, never hid her contempt. Younger, undeniably beautiful, and always dressed in the latest international designer trends, she looked at Emily as one might look at a stain on an expensive piece of clothing. "My brother has always had this romantic side," she used to say with a laugh to close friends. "He's always liked intense stories. But it passes. Trust me." Emily never responded. Victoria, Charlotte's inseparable friend, was always around. She had inherited her parents' fortune and possessed flawless social training. She had charm, influence, and knew how to play the game. With a friendly smile, she would sit next to James whenever she could, discussing business matters, offering suggestions, and making it seem as though they had been close friends forever, which, in part, was true. Charlotte's strategy was clear. Show the family, and James, that Victoria was the logical choice, while Emily was a temporary passion, an emotional whim. James, however, never left room for doubt. "I don't care who pleases others. I chose Emily, and if they can't respect that, it's not my problem." He was firm, direct, but not even the strongest love can be everywhere at once. When he wasn't around, the atmosphere changed. Emily would be ignored in important matters, left out of pictures, forgotten during toasts. Veiled comments about her background and supposed lack of preparation would circulate in the hallways, spoken as if without commitment, but intended to hurt. During one of Charlotte's birthday parties, held in the mansion's garden, Emily approached a group of women where Margaret was speaking about luxury travel. "Oh, Emily," said Margaret, noticing her presence, "we were talking about Capri, but perhaps you prefer more authentic destinations." Soft giggles followed. Emily smiled, steady. "I've been to Capri. My father used to say that the sunset scene from the top of Villa Hobis is a memory no one can ever take from you." Margaret fell silent. Emily knew that, in that moment, she had crossed a line. And even so, she chose to retreat. It wasn't time yet. James tried to ease the tension on many occasions. He reprimanded his mother, confronted his sister, kept his distance from Victoria. But Emily felt like someone who feels cold in the middle of summer, that the attempts to keep her at the margins persisted. One night, after a tense dinner, Emily opened up to him in their room. "It's not you. I know you love me. But the problem isn't what you feel. It's what they refuse to see." He came closer, holding her face in his hands. "I see, and that's all that matters." She smiled gently. "Sometimes, yes, but there are moments when the whole world needs to see too." It was the foreshadowing of what was to come, because Emily already felt the weight of judgment. She had already collected enough humiliations and fake smiles, and the gala ball would be the stage where she would choose to show, not just to the Montero family, but to the whole of society, that she was not an outsider in that world. She was, in fact, a woman who had chosen silence, until silence was no longer fair. There wasn't a single moment when Emily truly felt at ease under the Montero roof. At every event, every family lunch, every casual gathering in the mansion's flower-filled gardens, there was always something in the air, a disguised expectation, as if everyone were waiting for the moment when she would finally reveal herself to be inferior. The subtlety of the offenses was what hurt the most. They didn't come in shouts, but in pointed phrases, always spoken with a polite smile. It was an art Margaret mastered like few others. "Darling, that handbag of yours is peculiar. It looks like genuine leather. I imagine it was a gift from James." Or, "You have such an authentic way of dressing. Very you. These days, different is appreciated, isn't it?" Charlotte, on the other hand, preferred aggressiveness, disguised as advice. "Emily, you really need to learn how to handle our circle. You can't just walk into an event and act like it's a picnic. There are protocols, ways to talk, to carry yourself." Emily listened, stored it. and responded with the elegant silence of someone who knows her worth, even when the world insists on forgetting it. Victoria, ever present, was the most dangerous. She didn't attack with words, but with gestures. She got close to James at events, placed her hand on his arm, laughed loudly at his jokes, gave advice about family business. With each approach, she cast furtive glances at Emily, as if waiting for a reaction. But Emily didn't react. She knew she was being tested. She knew her entire presence in that world was an inconvenience, and any sign of weakness would be used against her. Even in the most elegant social settings, she was treated as if she'd been invited by mistake. At a dinner at the home of influential entrepreneurs, she sat next to a couple of Margaret's friends. The entire time, she was ignored. Not a single question was asked. No attempt at conversation. As if she were invisible. Later, in the car with James, she disguised the pain, but he noticed. "What is it?" he asked, placing his hand on hers. "Nothing worth responding to," she replied with a brief smile. Silence sometimes teaches more than any word. But the accumulation was inevitable. And over time, each detail weighed more. There was one particularly cruel day when Emily spent the afternoon organizing a lunch at Margaret's house. She wanted to surprise her mother-in-law with a delicate menu. White flowers on the table, and small personal touches in the decor. When everything was ready, Margaret entered, looked around, and said, without even smiling, "The intention was good. But here, we use noble flowers. These are too simple." Charlotte arrived shortly after, with Victoria in tow, and upon seeing the table, laughed. "Looks like something from a country house. How cute. All that's missing is the checkered tablecloth." Emily kept her composure, but inside she felt suffocated. She only allowed herself to cry when she was alone. She locked herself in the bathroom, lay on the cold marble floor, and let the tears fall in silence. James never saw her like that, because Emily believed that loving also meant protecting, and she didn't want him to feel guilty for the poison of his own family. Even so, James sometimes noticed, and when he heard something more direct, he didn't hesitate to defend his wife. During a charity dinner, Charlotte insinuated, in front of friends, that Emily still hadn't adapted to the Montero standard. Sister James responded firmly, "Emily is the standard I chose. And if you want to maintain any bond with me, you'll learn to respect that." It was a shock to everyone. But the change didn't last. When James wasn't around, everything went back to the way it was. The final straw came a week before the gala ball. Margaret organized a planning meeting with the events committee of patronesses. Emily, as the wife of one of the main names on the financial board, was invited. During the meeting, while discussing the gala night's details, Emily suggested a social project to allocate part of the funds to young classical music talents from underserved communities. Margaret interrupted her with an ironic smile, a touching idea. "But we must remember this is a high-standard event. We can't lose focus with sentimentalities." Charlotte, beside her, let out a discreet chuckle. Victoria pretended not to hear. Emily felt her face burn. It wasn't just contempt. It was public contempt. And it was in that moment that she decided. The night of the ball would no longer be a space for survival. It would be the turning point. She had already endured enough. She had stayed silent for love, for strategy, for politeness. But now it was time to show that her elegance was not weakness, that her simplicity was not ignorance, and that her silence was not submission. The golden envelope arrived on a cold morning, delivered by a messenger wearing black gloves and a neutral expression. It was the official invitation to the gala ball of the National Philanthropic Society, the most anticipated event on the elite's social calendar. James opened it with disinterest. To him, those parties were always variations of the same spectacle. Too much champagne, fake smiles, alliances forged out of convenience. But to his family, it was almost a sacred ritual. Emily, on the other hand, looked at the invitation calmly. She read every line, felt the weight of the thick paper, and saw in it an opportunity. "Shall we go?" he asked, without much enthusiasm. She took a few seconds before replying, "Yes, let's go." In that moment, something shifted in her eyes. At the Montero mansion, the announcement of Emily's presence at the ball was met with forced smiles and silent scheming. "At least, if she goes, everyone will know it was his choice, not ours," Margaret said to her daughter, while they browsed dresses in an exclusive atelier. "Imagine Victoria's face when she sees what she's wearing." "I bet she looked like a poorly dressed escort," Charlotte commented, holding a ruby red dress. "It'll be interesting." They didn't know that Emily had already chosen what she would wear. Days earlier, in secret, she had sent a special request to a French designer friend of her mother's, a woman who had designed for queens, actresses, and first ladies. The dress, already in production for weeks, was a unique piece, discreet at first glance, but with details only attentive eyes would notice. A perfect cut, imported fabric, hand-stitched embroidery, and a structure of elegance that didn't depend on glitter or excess. It wasn't just a garment, it was a statement. Meanwhile, James remained unaware of his mother's and sister's scheming. He was busy with meetings, travel, and major mergers. He sincerely believed that his presence was enough to protect Emily. "This ball is just another event," he said one night, holding her in his arms. "We'll go in, smile, toast, and leave. And, as always, you'll be the most beautiful woman in the room." Emily smiled, stroking his hair. "Yes, my love. It'll be a night to remember." Deep down, she knew it wouldn't be like other times, because that night, she wouldn't just be an escort. She would be the revelation. The chosen dress, the jewelry kept for years, the surname that had remained silent. Everything was about to emerge, not out of pride, but out of justice, because Emily had endured enough. And the stage that night would no longer belong to arrogance, it would belong to truth. The days leading up to the ball were marked by intense movement in high society. Tailors, makeup artists, hairdressers, and jewelers were racing against the clock. The venue reserved for the event was already being decorated with floral arrangements imported from the Netherlands and velvet curtains from Italy. At the Montero household, the mood was one of euphoria, but not for Emily. While Margaret and Charlotte paraded fabrics between dress fittings, she kept her distance, observing in silence. Every detail was recorded in her memory, like a rehearsed choreography, where everyone seemed to know the role they were meant to play, except her. One day, Charlotte walked into the room, wearing a dazzling dress, worthy of a runway. Victoria was with her. "Have you chosen what you're going to wear, Emily?" Charlotte asked, feigning interest. "I have," Emily replied, without taking her eyes off the book in her hands. Victoria, unable to hide the irony, commented, "I hope you had time to consult someone with experience. That night tends to be demanding." Emily gave a half smile. "It always is. But don't worry, Victoria. I have something made especially for the occasion." James entered shortly after, interrupting the uncomfortable exchange. Upon seeing him, Victoria changed her tone, as she always did. "James, you have to see my dress. I think you're going to love it." "I'd rather see my wife's," he replied, kissing Emily on the cheek. "She always surprises me." Victoria's expression faltered slightly, but Margaret quickly changed the subject. "It was always like that." Later, alone, James commented, "They're trying to provoke you, but you know, it won't last forever." "I know," Emily replied, her eyes turned toward the sky. "It's about to end." While everyone was betting on her failure, Emily was reviewing the final details of her appearance. The dress arrived from Paris in a velvet-lined case. It was unlike anything she had ever worn. The upper part, made of lightly satin fabric, embraced her body delicately. The skirt glided like silk to the touch. The neckline was elegant, with subtle cuts on the back. It was a piece that exuded sophistication without screaming for attention. The jewelry she would wear had been kept safe since her grandmother's passing, Historical pieces passed down through generations of Kingsley women, never displayed in public, since Emily had chosen to live anonymously. She took them from the box slowly, cleaning each piece with a linen cloth, a sapphire necklace, white gold earrings, and a discreet ring with a family crest. These were symbols of a lineage she had never used as a shield, but that now emerged, not as ostentation, but as armor against the prejudice she had endured. The night before the ball, Emily went to bed late. She couldn't sleep. James slept peacefully beside her, but she stared at the ceiling, heart racing. She thought of all the times she had swallowed her pride, all the veiled insults, the eyes searching for flaws in every detail of her. And now, the opportunity to show who she was would come naturally, effortlessly, without direct confrontation. It wasn't revenge, it was repositioning. On the morning of the big day, Margaret insisted on a family breakfast. With a table set by staff, they served exotic fruits, artisanal breads, and jams in crystal bowls. "I imagine everyone is excited for tonight," Margaret said, spreading butter on toast with elegance. "It's always an occasion when masks fall, and true elegance is revealed." "I agree," Emily replied calmly. "Tonight will be a night of revelations." Charlotte eyed her suspiciously, but remained silent. Hours later, preparations began. Margaret summoned her personal hairdresser. Charlotte rented an exclusive car to arrive at the ball in grand style. Emily, however, chose to get ready away from the mansion. She asked the designer to send a discreet professional to her hotel room downtown. She didn't want distractions. She wanted focus. While her hair was styled into a low bun, Emily kept her eyes closed. Her skin, softly illuminated by the carefully applied foundation, reflected the serenity of someone at peace. "Are you ready?" asked the makeup artist. Emily opened her eyes and replied with conviction, "I've been ready since the day they made me doubt myself." The dress was put on with care. The jewelry fit together like pieces of an ancestral puzzle. The perfume, chosen from her mother's collection, was light, with notes of jasmine and amber, elegant without being overwhelming. Looking in the mirror, Emily didn't just see beauty, she saw history. She saw every held-back tear, every respected silence, every pain transformed into strength. That night, she didn't need to prove anything. But even so, everyone would see. Night fell over the city like a veil embroidered with promises and expectation. Limousines crossed the avenues, reflecting the golden light of the street lamps and the restless glow in the eyes of onlookers. It was as if the entire city had stopped to witness the spectacle that would unfold in the grand hall of the Imperial Theater. The gala ball of the National Philanthropic Society was more than an annual event. It was a sort of social tribunal, where reputations were shaped, alliances forged, and missteps came at a high cost. In the theater's main hall, white marble columns supported French crystal chandeliers, suspended orchid arrangements and wildflowers, contrasting in their delicacy, filled the space with a refined fragrance. Guests paraded in impeccable attire, spoke in whispers, exchanged calculated kisses, and choreographed embraces. Charlotte was one of the first to arrive, dazzling in her ruby red gown. Her sharp smile, ready to be distributed among the most influential guests. Beside her, Victoria wore a tight black dress with a strategic slit and an emerald necklace she made a point of flaunting. Margaret arrived shortly after, dressed in navy blue and adorned with the family pearls. She walked with the poise of someone who knew exactly where she belonged in that scene. "Emily hasn't arrived yet?" Margaret asked after greeting the hosts. Charlotte, discreetly scanning the room, replied, "Not yet. Maybe she's making sure she doesn't mess up her entrance." The two laughed quietly, with the kind of mockery only those who believe themselves untouchable dare to display. Inside the hall, murmurs about James's wife began to circulate like stray sparks. Some hoped to see her make a faux pas. Others were simply curious about the woman who, despite being so reserved, had won over the Montero heir. James arrived a few minutes later, alone. Elegant in a tailored suit, He greeted guests kindly, but didn't linger. He was looking for Emily. He knew she had come in a different car, by her own choice. He wasn't worried, he was intrigued. Emily was never one for theatrics. And if she wanted to arrive later, there had to be a reason. And there was. At the exact moment the orchestra began the first notes of Strauss, the ballroom doors opened once more. A soft murmur swept through the room, like a silent wave before a storm. Emily entered. All eyes turned in her direction, as if drawn by an invisible force. She wasn't just beautiful, she was unbelievably elegant. The gown, in an almost ethereal shade of ivory, seemed to float around her body. The flawless cut subtly highlighted her curves. Delicate silver embroidery climbed from her hip to her left shoulder, like ivy blooming toward the light. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, with loose strands framing her face. White gold earrings dangled lightly, catching the chandelier light with subtlety. But what truly drew attention was the necklace resting on her collarbone, an antique, rare piece featuring a deep blue sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. A necklace that, to the most observant, was more than beautiful. It was symbolic, and it was this symbol that made Margaret's eyes widen. She recognized that necklace. She knew exactly where it came from. "No," she whispered, almost voiceless. Charlotte, following her mother's gaze, turned pale. "That's impossible." Emily walked gracefully, unhurried. Her steps echoed on the marble like music. Eyes followed her in complete silence. Conversations halted. Glasses froze in the air. James saw her and smiled, unable to hide his pride. He walked toward her, offering his arm. "You look indescribable." She smiled back. "I've waited for this night." The two walked together to the center of the room. The master of ceremonies, upon seeing them, approached the microphone to make the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that we welcome Mr. James Montero and his wife, Mrs. Emily." The last word fell like thunder over the ballroom. A second of silence. Then, the murmur, "Kingsley." The name hovered over old business dealings, international philanthropy, historic estates, a name among the 5 largest family empires in the country. Margaret dropped her glass for a moment. Charlotte held on to the nearest table, trying to mask her shock. Victoria simply froze. Emily remained composed. It was time, she said, just to James, for them to know who had been standing before them all along. He looked at her, eyes full of questions, but none of them doubtful. "I never needed your last name to love you. But, wow." Emily smiled. "I know." The news spread like wildfire. Whispered comments, hurried murmurs. Everyone wanted to know more. And at that moment, no one was talking about Charlotte or Victoria. The woman they had all deemed unfit was now more than suitable. She was untouchable. The dancing began. Emily was invited by 2 of the evening's most prominent businessmen. She declined graciously. She wanted to dance with James, and only with him. As they twirled in the center of the ballroom, Margaret approached. Her face was tense, but she smiled. "Emily, I had no idea." "I know," Emily replied, still smiling. "And yet, you allowed yourselves to look down on someone you didn't know." Margaret said nothing. Charlotte appeared beside her, voice low and unsure. "You should have told us. You should have listened." They stood there, unsure of what to say. Emily didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't cause a scene. Her presence was enough of an answer. And that night, among classical music and golden lights, Emily didn't just become the center of the party. She became the woman who, even without raising her voice, was heard by everyone. It was as if the ballroom had been plunged into a dense and reverent atmosphere. After the initial surprise, a new kind of attention took hold. Everyone wanted to be close. Everyone wanted to talk to her. Everyone wanted, in some way, to align themselves with the woman who, for so long ignored, now shone with the power of truth. Emily remained steady. With every new handshake, every whispered compliment in her ear, she smiled with the calm of someone who had long known the place she deserved to occupy. As the dancing continued and the toasts multiplied, one of the directors of the Philanthropic Society took the stage to give the evening's acknowledgments. It was tradition that during the ball, a few names would be highlighted for their contributions to the social projects supported by the organization. Emily and James were together when the microphone was turned on. We would like to give an honorable mention tonight to the presence of one of the most discreet and, as we now know, generous women of this generation, Mrs. Emily Whitmore Kingsley. On behalf of the Society's board, we thank you for years of silent donations, made in the name of third parties, but which we now officially recognize as coming from your family. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. Charlotte seemed unsure of where to hide. Victoria clutched her glass so tightly the stem nearly cracked. Emily felt her heart pounding. Not because of the recognition that had never driven her, but because, in that moment, it was no longer possible to pretend. None of them could go back. James looked at her with an expression of admiration. So that's why you were never bothered by the criticism. You already knew what you had. She nodded. I knew, but I needed them to know too. Right after the announcement, dozens of people came to greet her. Influential businessmen, journalists, politicians. Some asked for interviews. Others wanted a chance to speak with her later. I always knew there was something special about you, said one of the Society's patronesses, holding her hands. But I never imagined how much. Neither did I, Emily replied with a gentle smile. And as the ballroom once again filled with music, the reshaping of relationships began to take place before everyone's eyes. What had once been contempt was now flattery. What had been arrogance was now shame. Margaret approached with a look that mixed confusion, guilt, and pride. Emily, I don't have words. Emily looked at her gently. Words aren't necessary, Margaret. Their absence, over all these months, already taught me everything I needed to learn. Charlotte tried to smile, but her discomfort was evident. You deceived us. No, Emily replied calmly. I simply didn't need to prove anything. Those who demand proof are usually the ones who fail to see the essential. You're right, murmured Margaret. We were unfair. Emily took a deep breath. She looked at James, still by her side, as always. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, she said, but it can shape the future. Charlotte, eyes brimming with tears, tried to elicit some reaction, but Emily simply touched her arm lightly. I forgive you, but I'll continue in my own way. The words were spoken tenderly, but firm as steel. And in that moment, there was nothing left to say. On the dance floor, James pulled her in for another waltz. They spun gently, as if the rest of the world disappeared. I fell in love with you when you were just you, he said, resting his forehead against hers. And I only wanted to be loved for that. I've always loved you for that. The rest is just scenery. Yes, but sometimes the scenery has to change. And that night, Emily changed everything. Not out of imposition, not out of arrogance, but because being who she truly was, fully, finally felt safe. And in that golden ballroom, filled with memories built on masks, one woman, once silent, became unforgettable. The ball was beginning to wind down. Some tables stood empty, abandoned glasses scattered around, and the musicians now played in a gentler tone. But for Margaret and Charlotte, the night was far from over. The two waited until Emily stepped away from James for a moment. He was speaking with a tech investor. It was Charlotte who approached first. Her shoulders were hunched, and the once imposing dress now looked like a tight costume. Behind her, Margaret walked slowly, as if each step was an unspoken apology. Emily saw them coming, but didn't step back. She remained standing, eyes steady, hands resting lightly in front of her gown, as if bracing to hear what she already knew. Charlotte tried to smile. You look stunning tonight. Thank you, Emily replied softly. Margaret spoke next, after a restrained sigh. I wanted to ask for forgiveness, for everything. Emily didn't answer right away. She looked at both of them. as if searching, in that very moment, for the sincerity that had been so long denied her. "For everything?" she asked gently. "For humiliating me at Sunday lunches? For treating me like a mistake? Or for finally discovering I'm not what you imagined and, now fearing what that means?" Charlotte lowered her gaze. Margaret, visibly embarrassed, struggled for words. "We were wrong. Yes, we were. I let myself be led by ideas I've carried for years. I thought I was protecting my son. And instead, you hurt the woman he loves." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I can't undo what's been done, but I can acknowledge it." Emily took a deep breath. "You weren't wrong because you didn't know who I was. You were wrong because you believed someone only deserves respect when they carry a name or a fortune." Charlotte, her voice cracking, said, "I was cruel. Maybe, out of envy, for not being you." The silence between them lingered for a few seconds. The orchestra in the background played a soft adagio. Emily was not the kind of woman who held grudges, but she also wasn't the kind to pretend to forget. "I forgive you," she said at last. "But that doesn't mean everything will go back to the way it was." "What can we do?" Margaret asked. "How can we make it right? Live your lives with more kindness, more empathy. Respect those you don't know. And if one day you doubt someone, choose silence. The world already has too many cruel words." Margaret nodded. Her tear-filled eyes, for the first time, revealed something beyond pride. Charlotte wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. "Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for coming," Emily replied. "That's more than I expected." The two slowly walked away, and Emily remained there for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on the ballroom, as if watching a chapter come to a close. Shortly after, James returned, and, without saying a word, took her hand. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Now I am." And she knew she truly was. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't a gift to the other, it's a release for yourself. Outside the theater, the night remained quiet, lit only by the yellow glow of the street lamps and the last limousines pulling away from the venue. Emily and James walked hand in hand toward the car. There was no rush. The cool, early morning breeze brushed her face like a gentle whisper, as if the universe wanted to say, "It's over. You did it." James looked at his wife and smiled, captivated. "It was the most beautiful night of my life. Because of the music, the dancing, or because you finally found out who I am?" she teased playfully. He let out a soft laugh. "Because I saw you being exactly who you are, with courage, with grace, with strength. And because you chose me before all of this." Emily rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, feeling the warmth of the man who had embraced her so many times, even on days when the world seemed to push her away. "Did you know," she asked suddenly, "that I once thought about leaving?" "I did," he replied. "And I was afraid." She nodded slowly. "But I stayed, and I turned pain into strength." "You've always done that. But today, everyone saw it." They were silent for a moment. The city slept, and life, for the first time in a long while, felt at peace. "What do you want to do now?" he asked, opening the car door. Emily got in, settling gently, and answered without hesitation, "Live my way. No more hiding." As the car pulled away slowly, she looked out the window and watched the theater fade into the distance. A symbol, a stage. That night, she hadn't just been revealed. She had revealed herself. Not because she needed recognition, but because the truth, once it finally comes to light, has a shine that even the finest jewels can't outshine. And for Emily, the most beautiful light was the one that came from within. There are stories that don't need to shout to be heard. They are built in silence, in quiet pain, in the gaze that doesn't respond, but sees everything. Emily showed us that you don't need to carry a powerful name to be strong, that a woman's roots are not in her family tree, but in the ground she chooses to stand on, and that no matter how hard the world tries to label you, your worth is not defined by what you have, but by who you are, in the dark, in the silence, when no one is watching. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories from Lasting Tales. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged or underestimated because of what people assumed about you? I'd truly love to read what you have to say. And if you want to keep feeling, reflecting, and getting inspired by stories like this one, click on the next video right here on the channel. I'll be waiting for you there. Here at Lasting Tales, every story leaves marks that time cannot erase. See you in the next one.